we put together aggregate supply and aggregate demand and see how that helps us understand the economy better. The intersection of those curves is the short-run equilibrium. The big economics problem is the intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand does not necessarily have to be near the level of potential GDP. I mean, it might be. It'd be nice if it were. But it also might not be. And then that's not nice. If the equilibrium GDP in the short run is below potential, then that means unemployment is going to be higher. That's cyclical unemployment. A lot of people are not going to be at work. They'll want to get a job but cannot find a job. Or on the flip side, it could be that short-run equilibrium is above the level of potential GDP, so we get higher inflation. We could have either sort of problem because the short-run equilibrium does not necessarily get to the long-run equilibrium. So we'll distinguish the short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS, from the long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS. It's useful to rename potential GDP as long-run aggregate supply, LRAS. Now, from the beginning of this class, we've talked about the importance of productivity growth, particularly over long stretches of time. That compound growth is one of the most important factors explaining the wealth of nations. Why are some countries poor and other countries rich? Decades and decades of productivity growth. Productivity growth is really, really important. Now, in this simple graph here, what happens as the economy gets more productive? The aggregate supply curve shifts outward. Both the short-run aggregate supply and the long-run aggregate supply, they shift to the right. At any given price level, there's more output being produced. That's what productivity means. If the aggregate demand curve doesn't change, then as the aggregate supply curve shifts outward, that means real GDP rises and the price level falls. It gets cheaper to produce the same level of output. Now, while productivity growth can shift the AS curve outward, it can also shift, or the AS curve can also shift inwards because of things like input price shocks. Now, of course, something is always getting more expensive, but from a macro perspective, we worry about the really big things that affect the entire economy. Oil or energy prices being one of the biggies. Now, from the perspective of climate change, we would like to diminish this impact, but it's still the case that oil is a significant input into most everything made in the economy. If oil prices suddenly rise, then that's like a negative productivity shock, since now it costs more to make the exact same level of output. Now, there can be other supply input price shocks, particularly for small countries that import a bunch of vital inputs into production. Recently, after the pandemic lockdown, the U.S. faced shortages of lots of different things, including computer chips. Those are kind of a big thing, too. Problems with supply chains means it becomes more expensive to produce the same amount of stuff. In the graph there, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts inward. Whether you want to call a shift to the left or want to call it a shift up, it's a little bit of both. As AS shifts inward, then equilibrium GDP will be reduced and the price level will rise. Now, I mentioned a lot of different things that can shift the aggregate demand curve, since aggregate expenditure is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. One way these might shift is due to changes in people's expectations, such as changes in consumer confidence. As consumer confidence rises, people are more willing to buy any number of different products, particularly things like durable goods and housing. Consumer durables are a big segment of consumption. Washing machines, televisions, stoves, things that last a while. Confidence is important since people are spending money now in the expectation they will use the thing over many years. For housing, interest rates are really important. That determines people's mortgage rates. Even for renters, because interest rates determine how much the landlord needs to charge to cover their mortgage. For things like consumer durables, interest rates are important. Whether people buy or lease, interest rate is going to determine how expensive those payments will be. Consumer spending depends primarily on disposable income, defined as income after taxes. So changes in taxes are going to shift consumer spending. If taxes go up, people don't have as much money in their paycheck, then they'll spend less. Oppositely, if taxes go down, then people have more money in their paycheck, so their spending can go up. Consumer confidence is important as well, but that begs the question about what changes consumer confidence. And that's a complicated bit of the story. We'll come back to that in the future. Business confidence is also important in shifting investments, because business investment is spending a lot of money now because they expect in the future it'll be worth it. Just for instance, if you own a restaurant, maybe you want to expand that restaurant. That takes a certain amount of money spent. Either you're going to move to a different location or you're going to build an addition to the current space. You're making a significant expenditure now in expectation that future revenues will justify that. Businesses try to make rational judgments about the future, but at some level it comes down to confidence. Interest rates, though, are certainly going to be important because businesses generally need to take out a loan in order to make these kinds of investments. So what sort of things change net exports? X minus M. Shifts in exchange rates, shifts in tariffs, shifts in conditions abroad. You could say confidence of foreigners. The distribution of income here in the U.S. is important also, to the extent that richer people are more likely to buy fancy luxury goods like cars and nice wine and that kind of thing. Now, looking at G in the aggregate expenditure function, which, remind, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M, G is government fiscal policy. Government choices can change G directly, or they can change the level of taxes, T, to change disposable income. Monetary policy can change interest rates, which, as we've talked through, interest rates change a lot of different behavior for consumers and businesses. Here I've drawn the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right, meaning that at any given price level, there's more aggregate expenditure. Any of C, I, G, and or X minus M rise, which shifts aggregate demand to the right, and equilibrium real GDP rises, and the price level rises as well. How much will the price level rise? That depends on where we are on the aggregate supply curve. If the aggregate supply curve is steep, then that means GDP only rises a bit, but the price level rises a lot more. Oppositely, if we're at the flatter part of the aggregate supply curve there, then GDP rises, but prices don't rise by much. The slope of the aggregate supply curve determines the balance between changes in GDP versus changes in the price level as AD changes.